In July of 1863, 71,000 Confederate troops, headed by General Robert E. Lee, and 93,000 Union troops headed by General George Meade, met at a small town in south-central Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. On July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, an engagement described as the largest ever in the Western Hemisphere took place, and when it was over, there were 51,000 dead, wounded, and missing. 569 tons of artillery shells were fired in 72 hours. It was the turning point of the American Civil War. After Lee's victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, he moved his army north to take the pressure off war-torn Northern Virginia and set his goals on a northern city like Harrisburg, hoping a victory would pressure the Northerners for a peace settlement. In June of 1863, moving west of the Blue Ridge Mountains for cover, Lee's Pennsylvania campaign began. He asked General Jeb Stuart and his cavalry to go east of the Blue Ridge. Figuring that the Union Army would soon follow, he wanted Stuart to be his eyes and ears on their location. Gettysburg, in south-central Pennsylvania, sits just above the Mason-Dixon line, dividing north from south. Carroll County sits just below the Mason-Dixon line in north-central Maryland. Most of the Union troops and Stuart's Confederate cavalry went through Carroll County, Maryland, en route to Gettysburg. 60,000 troops in all. Its rich farmland which could sustain troops, a good road system that could move troops, and a new train depot which could supply troops made Carroll County ideal for passage of any army. Gettysburg is the most visited battlefield in the United States. It was the high water mark of the Confederacy, and it is the battle that Civil War soldiers wrote about the most. This is the story about the role that Carroll County played in the Battle of Gettysburg. This is a story about Carroll County and the path to Gettysburg. Trains played a pivotal role in the military for the first time during the Civil War. They would move troops, supplies, the wounded, and prisoners.
The American Civil War is really the first war where trains play an important part in transportation, not just of materials, but of men as well. In 1861, there were troops that were transported by rail right out to the battlefield. In 1862, in front of Richmond, men were put on trains and taken right out to the battlefield. And it's no different here in the North. Trains and railroads are very, very important for supply, establishing depots where stores can be kept, because they don't all ship them right down to the Army in Virginia. They keep them throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania before they are then transported down there. But the railroads are very, very important. The railroad system into Westminster makes it extremely important because there are shops there, they're going to have a warehouse there for Union supplies, and eventually that's going to make a big difference as far as the Army of the Potomac is concerned when it travels through Carroll County. Supplies and materials coming up the railroad from Baltimore and Washington and Alexandria will end right there in Westminster. From there it will be distributed in wagons to logistically follow up and supply the Army as it moves north into Pennsylvania.
General Herman Haupt, who was in charge of the U.S. military railroads, and his crews prepared the railroad from Westminster to Baltimore for heavy-duty loads to supply the Army of the Potomac. Shortly after July 1st, 30 trains were moving 1,500 tons of supplies and ammunition each day to Westminster, which were then taken by wagons directly to the Army in Gettysburg. After the battle, thousands of wounded and prisoners came through the Westminster Depot. The railroad had a major effect on the Civil War in Carroll County, making Westminster the supply center for the Army of the Potomac during the Gettysburg Campaign. In 1863, General Hancock and his Second Corps spent June 29th and 30th in Uniontown, and many of his men used the time to write letters to loved ones before moving north to Pennsylvania. They mailed their letters at this building on Uniontown Road, which was then the post office. One of these letters was sent by Captain David Atchison of the 140th Pennsylvania Volunteers to his mother, when he wrote,
"All look anxiously for news from Pennsylvania. I hope this is but the beginning of the final defeat of the Rebs.
Captain Atchison was killed on July 2nd at Gettysburg. For many, these were the last letters ever written. Over 4,000 of Hancock's men died in Gettysburg. In Taneytown, Hancock's 2nd Corps and General Sickles' 3rd Corps passed through in June of 1863 en route to Pennsylvania. The new commander of the Union Army, General George Meade, appointed on June 28th, arrived in Taneytown June 29th, where he made his headquarters on Route 194. An important form of communication in the Army was signaling from high towers or hills, with flags in daylight and torches at night. Trinity Church in Taneytown served as the Signal Corps headquarters on June 30th, and then communicated with Gettysburg, mainly from Little Round Top, with messages that took 7 to 11 minutes. From Taneytown, Meade, not certain of Lee's exact location, placed troops along Pipe Creek in Carroll County to defend the impending confrontation and also to keep Washington safe, which he was responsible for protecting. Once the battle in Gettysburg began, Meade left Taneytown late on July 1st and made his new headquarters on the battlefield. Westminster, the county seat, witnessed a pre-Gettysburg encounter with deadly results. As Lee and his army moved north into Pennsylvania, he sent General Stuart and his cavalry to keep an eye on Union Army movement. Lee was expecting important information, but a small, bloody skirmish at Westminster delayed Stuart's arrival in Gettysburg. On June 28, 1863, Company C and D of the 1st Delaware Cavalry, commanded by Major Napoleon Knight, arrived in Westminster, with company commanders Captain Charles Corbit and Lieutenant Caleb Churchman. They were there to protect the all-important railroad. With less than 100 soldiers, they made camp on the Commons, which is where McDaniel College sits now. It was high ground and offered a great lookout of the surrounding land. Also in town was a detachment of the 150th New York Infantry as Provost Guard. On the morning of June 29th, General Jeb Stuart and 3 brigades of Confederate cavalry crossed into Carroll County at Hood's Mill, where they damaged railroad tracks and set fire to a small railroad bridge in Sykesville, before heading on to Westminster. Around 4 p.m., the advance unit of Stuart's 6,000-member cavalry, the 4th Virginia, entered Westminster.
Jeb Stuart's primary role during the Gettysburg campaign is to be the eyes and the ears of Lee's army. Unfortunately, Stuart does not really prescribe to that. He more enjoys the gallant riding around and capturing of Union wagons and Union stores, but he's not staying in direct contact with Lee. And that is a huge failure on behalf of the Confederate cavalry leader, and really leads to failure on behalf of Lee and his strategy for the next couple of days. He doesn't know where the Army of the Potomac is. Where Stuart, who has had several encounters with elements of the Army of the Potomac, the advance of the Army of the Potomac, and rear elements, does not let Lee know what he's found, where they are, or where he is. And so both basically are lost to each other. As Stuart rides through Carroll County and approaches the small city of Westminster, Maryland on June 29th, he realizes, or his scouts report to him, that there is a small detachment of Union troops in Westminster. This is Company C and D of the 1st Delaware Cavalry under Major Napoleon Bonaparte Knight. The more important person really is Captain Charles Corbit, who's the company commander of Company C of the 1st Delaware Cavalry. And on the report from a civilian that the Confederates are approaching from the east side of Westminster, he mounts everybody he can and rides to the other end of town, where he finds the advanced elements of Stuart's division, primarily men of the 4th Virginia Cavalry. The fight that ensues there is very short, very quick, but also very bloody. The 1st Delaware suffers a lot of casualties, as does the 4th Virginia. It stops Stuart for just a brief amount of time. But then Stuart will take the aftermath of that time to regale in the attention he gets from the ladies there in Westminster, who are very pro-Confederate in their beliefs and their actions, and he accepts tea at a place downtown, and eventually he decides to ride on and find out what's north of Westminster. But by that time, it's much later that he should have been actually advancing and keeping an eye and an ear as to what was around him. He was not paying attention enough to the Union positions around Westminster, Union positions south of him, nor was he communicating at all with Lee's army. And that's a major failure on the Confederate commander's part.
From this small but pivotal skirmish in Westminster, there were 11 Union wounded and 2 dead. 2 Confederate lieutenants were killed and 10 wounded. All were cared for in makeshift hospitals throughout the town. Most of the Delaware soldiers and members of the 150th New York Provost Guard who did not escape were taken prisoner, including Corbit and churchmen. Local doctors and civilians were helping with the wounded. A local doctor reflects,
"The dead and the wounded were lying in the street, and we were at war indeed. Immediately after the cavalry fight, the Confederates began to pass into Westminster. General Stuart dismounted. I met him and had quite a conversation with him. He was tall and erect, well proportioned, with a large bony frame, full beard, and looked every inch a cavalry leader." Dr. Herring, Reflections on Corbit's Charge.
all 4 dead were buried in the town cemetery. 3 of their families were able to claim their relatives, which was rare because of the expense. 1, Lieutenant William Murray of the 4th Virginia Cavalry, remains today and was moved to the graveyard of the Ascension Church on Court Street. At the time of the battle, there was a beautiful Union flag flying on top of the courthouse. It was made by resident Mrs. Molly Huber and 12 other ladies who embroidered their names on each star. Abraham Huber, Molly's husband, and the court clerk immediately removed the flag and placed it in the courthouse vault for safekeeping. Local Confederate sympathizers told Stuart about the flag. He wanted it and ordered Captain John Eston Cook to get it. He broke into the vault with an axe, grabbed the flag, and then sent it on to Richmond. This minor skirmish delayed Stuart's arrival at Gettysburg. Instead of moving on to Pennsylvania to inform Lee of important information, he stayed overnight in Westminster. That night, Stuart's men spent the night spread out along Route 97 and at Union Mills. The next morning, June 30th, Stuart had breakfast at Union Mills. Shortly after Stuart's men left Westminster, late on June 29th, General Gregg and the Union cavalry came through the town. And the next day, June 30th, 15,000 men of General Sedgwick's 6th Corps marched through Westminster en route to Manchester. It was a sight to behold. In the summer of 1863, Marylanders could still keep their slaves, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, because Maryland did not secede. Maryland sent both Confederate and Union troops to Gettysburg, as noted on the state's battlefield monument, resulting in divided loyalties. On Littlestown Pike, known today as Route 97 North, 15 miles south of Gettysburg and 7 miles north of Westminster, is Union Mills, settled in 1797 by the Shriver brothers, who built a thriving mill. Shortly after Corbit's charge in Westminster, on June 29th, Stuart's men, while heading towards Pennsylvania, made camp at Union Mills. On June 30th, just hours after the Confederates left, General Sykes' Union 5th Corps arrived at Union Mills. Divided loyalties were present again in Carroll County, even within one family.
Hello, I'm James Shriver, and I'm happy to welcome you to Union Mills and tell you a little bit about the Civil War here in the Gettysburg campaign. On the night of June 29, 1863, Andrew Shriver's family was awoken by their slave Ruth Dorr and told that the yard was full of soldiers. Andrew K. Shriver and his daughters went outside to meet the Confederate cavalrymen, and promptly Andrew told them, "I'm a Union man," and they threatened to take him prisoner, and his 2 daughters, Eliza and Kate, held on to him, and the soldiers let him go. They did take the family horses. The next several days, the family entertained both the Confederate and the Union soldiers. The Confederates here were fed flapjacks in the old kitchen, and they were so hungry they grabbed them off the old griddle even before they were cooked. While across the road, William Shriver's family lived, and William was a Southern sympathizer. And when Jeb Stuart arrived, they entertained him for breakfast. And as host, they also had the piano in the parlor played, and Jeb Stuart sang, "If you're a bully boy, join the Cavalry," and thanks for the breakfast. Also, at that time, William Shriver had 3 sons serving in the Confederate Army. Their 4th son, T. Herbert, then became guide for Jeb Stuart, taking him the back roads to Hanover and participating in the entire Gettysburg campaign. As a result, he became an appointment to VMI. On the morning of June 30th, the Confederate cavalrymen departed Union Mills, and it was only about 4 hours after the Confederate cavalrymen departed, with T. Herbert Shriver as their guide to Hanover, that the Sykes' 5th Corps arrived here in Union Mills. And that afternoon, the General Barnes, a division commander, decided to make the homestead his headquarters. And the Union side of the family, Andrew Case, entertained the Union officers here in the home. In fact, they played the old piano in the parlor, and they sang "When This Cruel War Is Over." The daughters remarked that the soldiers didn't quite do it justice.
For 2 Shriver cousins serving the Union in Corbit's charge, one escaped, and the other, a courier for the Provost Guard, was captured. Little did the Shriver family know their cousin David Keener Shriver was being held prisoner by Stuart when they entertained the general and his officers for breakfast. During the Gettysburg campaign in Carroll County, when an army came through, many residents suffered huge losses through no choice of their own.
While the Confederate and Union soldiers were here, the family fed them biscuits, flapjacks, bread, milk, just about everything that they had. They literally talk about being eaten out of house and home. The Confederate soldiers were most gracious, with Jeb Stuart singing for his breakfast, while the Union soldiers did pay a rate of 25 cents for meals served. Also, they camped in the entire area surrounding the family's property, and in the camping, they used the new split rail fence for firewood for their campfires. They camped in the crops, destroying the family's crops and hay that they hadn't harvested yet.
Lee was active in south-central Pennsylvania, with Harrisburg as his initial goal. Stuart had still not contacted Lee about the position of the Army of the Potomac. It was only after a spy named Harrison on June 28th revealed to Lee the location of the Union Army that he began to pull back his forces to Cashtown near Gettysburg. Soon after, Meade ordered his army north towards Gettysburg and abandoned his Pipe Creek plan. General Sedgwick and the huge Sixth Corps was called back from Manchester on July 1st and ordered to Gettysburg. En route, they saw a migration of soldiers, wagons, horses, and cannons moving north. Thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers converged on this small town in Pennsylvania, and after hearing the news from Harrison, Lee said, "A battle thus became unavoidable."
The armies are moving northward. Lee is moving into south central Pennsylvania. His target really is Harrisburg, not to lay siege to it or attack it, but to at least isolate it, cut it off. And in doing so, he can basically cut the North in half. All of the communications, the railroad system, everything goes through Harrisburg. The army advances northward trying to find Lee's army, trying to find that army in Northern Virginia. And when Lee finally does hear that the Union Army is north of the Potomac River, much further north than he thought, and is right there on the Pennsylvania border, he'll try and concentrate his army at Cashtown. That's about 8 miles west of Gettysburg. But to get there, everybody has to come through Gettysburg because all the roads in this area run right through this little town. And it's on June 30th that a Confederate patrol under James J. Pettigrew first spots Union cavalry riding northward. He's not really sure who these men are, but he's under strict orders. Don't bring on a battle. Don't start a fight right now. He retreats, goes back towards Cashtown, reports what he finds, and early the next morning, he and several 1,000 others marched towards Gettysburg to find out who these men were. Well, this is John Buford and his Cavalry Division, lead of the Army of the Potomac. And right behind him is about 12 to 14,000 Union infantry marching northward from Emmitsburg, Maryland, as well as Taneytown, Maryland, Westminster. They're coming from all over now, moving northward into south central Pennsylvania. And they'll congregate here at Gettysburg July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. George Gordon Meade will move his headquarters from Taneytown eventually to Gettysburg, arriving here very, very late on July 1st, and realizes that this will be the place to fight his battle. For a number of reasons, his supply wagons and supply trains are still left behind him at Taneytown, Manchester, and Westminster. And why Westminster? It's because of the rail system. It's the most dependable rail system, the most protected rail system, the most protected railroad into his rear. Meade also realizes that if he has to fight a defensive battle and can't hold this place here called Gettysburg, he'll fall back to a line along Pipe Creek, Maryland. Perfect defensive line several miles north of Westminster that's established with Union Mills right there in the center.
On July 1st, 1863, with over 160,000 troops, Gettysburg, the largest battle in the Western Hemisphere, begins, and it goes for 3 days. July 1st, Day 1. The encounter starts west of town on Chambersburg Road, today's Route 30. Union dismounted cavalry engaged Confederate infantry heading east around 8 a.m. on McPherson Ridge. At 10 a.m., Union General Reynolds arrives with the needed manpower of the First Corps. As the general is urging his troops on about 15 minutes into the battle, he is shot in the back of the head and dies instantly. He is taken to Union Bridge in Carroll County, where Western Maryland Railroad pattern maker John Hollenberger prepares a coffin for him. The body is then transported by rail to Baltimore, prepared for burial and the trip home to Lancaster. When Meade learns of Reynolds' death, he sends up General Hancock from Taneytown to take over command. Eventually, the fighting spreads to north of Gettysburg, and around 3 p.m., the Confederates break the Union line, forcing them south through the town. And then Hancock makes his base on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. General Meade arrives very late at night and moves his headquarters to Gettysburg from Taneytown, taking over the home of Lydia Leicester, a Carroll County woman who flees to Silver Run. The Confederates have won the day. July 2nd, Day 2. Large reinforcements arrive for both sides. Confederate Cavalry Commander General Stuart, who visited Union Mills and engaged Union cavalry in Westminster, finally arrives and shares information with Lee. Around 4 p.m., Union General Sykes' 5th Corps, that camped at Union Mills, was 10 minutes ahead of General Longstreet's 1st Corps on ascending the strategically important Little Round Top. A fierce fight cost both sides heavily, but the Union held the high ground and finally won. Union General Sedgwick's huge 6th Corps, after a brutal march over 30 miles through much of Carroll County, under Meade's order to get to Gettysburg, arrived just in time to back up the Union defensive line. General Sickles of the Union 3rd Corps, who came through Carroll County, loses a leg in the merciless bloodshed of the Wheatfield, and 22-year-old Captain David Atchison of Hancock's 2nd Corps, who mailed his last letter to his mother from Uniontown, is killed in the Wheatfield, which changed sides many times. Hancock is holding the Union line toward early evening at great expense along Cemetery Ridge while waiting for reinforcements from Culp's Hill. In late evening, Confederate General Ewell and his 2nd Corps begin to dominate the Union right flank on Culp's Hill. Here, Maryland Confederates fought Maryland Union troops. The 12th Corps, which came through Carroll County, sets up on Culp's Hill. Around 7 p.m., General Ewell's men take the lead on Culp's Hill and Spangler Spring. They also fiercely attack General Hancock on Cemetery Hill, but there the Union is able to hold. Meade decides, because Lee attacked both Union flanks, he will probably strike in the center on Day 3. Day 2 is considered a draw. July 3rd, Day 3. Culp's Hill fighting resumes around 4 a.m. and goes to near noon, becoming a Union victory. At 1 p.m., Lee fires all his cannon power towards the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. The Union returns the fire, The thunder is so loud it is said to be heard in Washington. Following the cannonade around 3 p.m., General Pickett's charge begins as 12,000 courageous Confederates march toward the Union line center, the copse of trees. Generals Hancock and Gibbon rally the Union troops into position. In less than an hour, there are thousands of Confederate casualties. Hancock is wounded. Then Gibbon takes over, and he is wounded and sent to Westminster, to the home of Rose Neal, who tends to his wounds, as she is his wife's aunt. But her thoughts are with her two sons, riding with Confederate cavalry. Concurrent with Pickett's charge 3 miles east of Gettysburg, Union 2nd Division Cavalry Commander General Gregg confronts General Stuart's Confederate cavalry, trying to get behind the Union right. These two great leaders, who both came through Carroll County and knew each other at West Point, engage in a fierce battle on East Cavalry Field. Gregg is successful. When Pickett's charge is repulsed, the battle is over. The Union victory prompts Lee's retreat on July 4th. Gettysburg is considered the high water mark of the Confederacy. Lee will never come this far north again. There are 51,000 dead, wounded, and missing. 22,000 wounded are left behind in a town of only 2,400. The thousands of wagons and mules present daily in Carroll County, moving supplies to the field, begin to dwindle down. The rumble of cannons is not heard anymore in Union Mills and Westminster. Citizens knew something was ending, but who won? As thousands of Confederate prisoners are marched down Littlestown Pike past county residents, the outcome is clear.
The 3 days of battle here really devastated both armies, especially the Army of the Potomac. They now had several thousand prisoners on their hand, thousands of wounded, and also had suffered very, very heavy casualties here. Now they had to pursue Lee all the way to the Potomac River. Meade relied on the supply depot and the railroad at Westminster for a number of reasons. To get all of his wounded back, to get his prisoners back, they all marched down through Carroll County. At Westminster, they were put aboard trains that then transported them to prison camps in eastern Maryland as well as New York. Westminster was also important for a number of the wounded that were taken back there, the wounded that were transported by rail from Westminster to hospitals in Baltimore, Washington, Alexandria, and from there even as far north as Philadelphia and New York Harbor. Last but not least, Westminster itself became a repair depot, for lack of a better term, for all the damaged artillery and wagons and injured horses from the Battle of Gettysburg.
Damaged cannons sit on Court Street in Westminster, awaiting repair. One of them, the famous Gettysburg gun, hit by so many Confederate shells, its heated nozzle molded around the Union shell in its chamber, as Rhode Island artillery fired on Pickett's charge. There was great activity around Westminster as the depot transferred thousands of wounded and prisoners. And in November, following the battle, President Lincoln was in Gettysburg to dedicate the new Soldiers' National Cemetery. He spoke for 2 minutes in his Gettysburg Address, which became one of the most famous speeches in American history. When Lincoln predicted that the world can never forget what they did here in his Gettysburg Address, he was right. This was the largest battle in the Western Hemisphere. It was the turning point of the American Civil War. Today, each year, over 3 million visitors come to imagine and feel what happened there. Gettysburg is studied in military training. It was a world-class event, and very important in that event was the role of Carroll County, Maryland. Over 60,000 Confederate and Union troops came through this county. Because of the fine road system, the important rail link, the good farmland, and such a strategic location just below the Mason-Dixon line and due south of Gettysburg, Carroll County was ideal for armies on the move. Take a trip through Carroll County's small towns and beautiful farmland and drive up to Gettysburg. Walk the battlefield and take in the beauty and awe of that profound place. As you drive through the county towards Gettysburg and back, think of all that went before you on the very roads you are traveling, and try to imagine what it was like, what they were experiencing, and then you begin to understand how Carroll County was indeed the path to Gettysburg.